The executive branch. This lecture is about several executive branch offices: the Comptroller of Public Accounts, the Attorney General, the Commissioner of Agriculture, the State Board of Education, the Secretary of State, and I'll also talk just a little bit about professional licensing and examining boards. You can see in this chart the government structure of Texas. The electorate chooses, by voting, several branches of the executive government in Texas: the Comptroller of Public Accounts, the Attorney General, the Governor, the Lieutenant Governor, and the Commissioner of the General Land Office are all chosen by voters in statewide elections. The State Board of Education is also chosen by voters. The Commissioner of Agriculture and the Texas Railroad Commission are all chosen directly by voters. The Secretary of State, however, is selected by the governor, not elected by voters. The Comptroller of Public Accounts currently is Glenn Hager, pictured here. The biennial revenue estimate and the budget process. This section is going to discuss the Texas Comptroller's role, which is an important one, in the budget process, and the budget process overall, how it works. So the budget process begins during the year prior to each regular session of the state's legislature, which are held in odd-numbered years. In other words, since the legislature meets in odd-numbered years, the budget process begins in even-numbered years. In even-numbered years, each state agency prepares a detailed legislative appropriations request, called an LAR, under the guidelines of the state's Legislative Budget Board, the LBB. These LARs itemize the funding each agency feels it needs and include performance measures designed to ensure the money is spent efficiently and effectively. These LARs are sent to the Legislative Budget Board, the Comptroller of Public Accounts Office, and several other state agencies. The Legislative Budget Board and the Governor's Office of Budget Planning and Policy hold hearings on their content. In the fall, before this legislative session, the Legislative Budget Board uses the LARs, the Legislative Appropriations Requests, to prepare a draft of the state's General Appropriations Bill, which will provide state agencies and institutions with funding for the next 2 fiscal years. At the beginning of the legislative session, the Comptroller's Office issues its Biennial Revenue Estimate, BRE, a careful estimate of the funds likely to be available from taxes and other revenue sources over the next 2 years. The Texas Constitution makes the BRE a cap on legislative spending. So, in January of 2023, you can expect the Texas Comptroller's Office to issue a biennial revenue estimate to help legislators plan for the 2024-2025 budget. This is a picture of a chart from the biennial revenue estimate from January 2021. In the upper right-hand corner, in the yellow box, you can see an explanation of the BRE. It says, before each regular legislative session, the Texas Comptroller issues the biennial revenue estimate to inform lawmakers of the funds available to spend on state programs through the next 2-year budget period. Due to the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, lawmakers can expect a negative beginning balance as they begin writing the 2022-2023 state budget. Notice in the column for 2020 to 2021, the total revenue available for general purpose spending was $112.96 billion. But in 2022-2023, that goes down slightly. The total revenue available is $112.53 billion. So it went down $0.44 billion, a slight reduction, which was attributable to the economic effects of COVID-19. This is a revised biennial revenue estimate. The Comptroller issued this in May 2021, and it says the Comptroller is revising the BRE to reflect higher than expected revenues as the state navigates unprecedented economic uncertainty in the pandemic's wake. So the revision says that now the Comptroller expects the total revenue available for general purpose spending in 2022 and 2023 to go up to $115.65 billion. This is roughly $3 billion more than the Comptroller had estimated just a few months earlier. This chart shows you where the state tax revenue comes from. You can see there are lots of different sources, but the biggest one at 59.4% is sales tax. So the sales tax provides most of the state tax revenue. There are various other taxes. There's a motor vehicle tax, a franchise tax, a motor fuels tax, oil production tax, and so on. In the biennial revenue estimate, the Comptroller issued an estimate of where he expected taxes to come from in 2022-2023. Not surprisingly, the expectation was that sales taxes would provide most of the revenue, 61.7%, up slightly from the previous cycle. This chart shows new sources of sales tax revenue. In the upper right corner, it explains what that means. The state's ability to benefit from a consumer shift to online purchasing drove higher than expected sales tax revenues. Out-of-state online vendors and marketplace providers were not required to collect Texas taxes until late in 2019, following the U.S. Supreme Court's Wayfair decision and subsequent legislation. Monthly sales tax collections were down in 8 of the last 9 months compared to the previous year, but the drop would have been greater if not for tax collections from online sellers. If you look at the chart on the left, it shows you the remote seller and marketplace provider sales tax revenue from September 2019 to December 2020. Remember, this was most of these months were during the COVID pandemic. And what it shows you is that most of the sales tax was from marketplace providers, but a fairly significant portion of it, the part in yellow, was from remote sellers, most online sellers. The chart on the right shows monthly sales tax collections and the percent change from the previous year. Notice that in April, May, and June of 2020, monthly sales tax collections were down significantly, about 9% in April, about 13% in May, and about 6 or 7% in June. In 8 of the 9 months of the last 9 months of 2020, sales taxes were down compared to the previous year. Only in 1 month, July, were sales tax collections actually higher. Again, most of the explanation for sales tax collections being lower than the previous year is because stores were shut due to the COVID pandemic. This page shows tax revenue, monthly tax collections, and the percent change from the previous year. So the pandemic and collapsing oil prices caused a severe economic contraction in the first and second quarters of calendar 2020. The crisis was particularly hard on revenue sources such as severance, hotel occupancy, and alcoholic beverage taxes. While they have rebounded from their low points, they remain well below collections in the same period of 2019. Sales tax revenue, while stronger than expected, has been down from the previous year in 8 of the last 9 months. Fallout from the pandemic will continue to curb growth in economic activity and sales tax collections in the near term. So here are the controllers again explaining that sales tax collections were down in 8 of the last 9 months of 2020 and expecting them to be lower than usual into the future. So the Texas legislature takes all of that information and uses it to plan its budget. The Texas House Committee on Appropriations and the Senate Finance Committee hold hearings on the General Appropriations Bill and make changes, reflecting the BRE's limits and their funding priorities. When the committees complete their versions of the bill, they send them to the full House and Senate for approval. These two bills then go to a conference committee made up of members of both the House and Senate, which resolve their differences to produce a single bill. Both houses then vote on this bill, and once approved, it goes to the Comptroller's office for certification. Certification is a formal statement from the Comptroller that the bill spends no more than the amounts reflected in the BRE. Here you see a picture of Texas Comptroller Glenn Hager officially certifying the 2022-2023 state budget. The Comptroller issued this statement announcing his certification of the budget and explaining, giving more detail about that. This was an interesting page from the Texas Comptroller's website relevant, explaining the certification of the 2018-2019 Texas state budget. It's the most recent such page I could find, but it has some interesting information here. One of the interesting things is the budget highlights section, which shows what the biggest amount of spending is in the state budget. And notice it's Medicaid with $62.4 billion. In second place is public education with $59.9 billion, and then transportation with $26.6 billion, higher education $20.5, and then a significant drop. Fifth place is the teacher retirement system with $5.2 billion, behavioral health 4.0, and border security 0.8. The big number, $216.8 billion, is how much the Texas government would be able to spend or certified to spend over the next 2 years. That comes to about $7,781 per Texas resident. The bill then faces a final hurdle, the governor's signature. Texas has a line item veto, allowing the governor to trim individual spending items from the bill as he or she sees fit. This veto can be overridden by a 2/3 majority vote in each house, but in practice, the governor's decisions are rarely challenged. Once signed, the bill becomes law, directing the state's finances for 2 more years. Here's an overview of the Texas budget process. Number 1, state agencies send LARs, legislative appropriations requests, to the Legislative Budget Board. Then the Legislative Budget Board and the Governor's Office of Budget Planning and Policy hold hearings, and the Legislative Budget Board uses the LARs to prepare a draft of the General Appropriations Bill. Then the Comptroller's Office issues the Biennial Revenue Estimate. Then the House Committee on Appropriations and Senate Finance Committee hold hearings on the General Appropriations Bill and make changes. The House and Senate approve the Appropriations Bill with any changes made, and then a conference committee produces a single bill that resolves the differences between the House and Senate appropriations bills. Once approved by the House and Senate, the bill goes to the Comptroller's office for certification. The certified bill is then sent to the Governor's office for either a signature, a veto, or a line item veto. This chart shows a graphic visualization of the process. In red, you see the odd years. This is when the legislature is meeting. These are also the years when the Comptroller has to issue the BRE and certify the final budget, and the governor has to decide whether to veto, sign, or use a line item veto on the budget. In blue, you have the even years, and these are the years where planning is taking place. The next office I want to discuss briefly is the Office of the Attorney General. The Current Attorney General is pictured here. His name is Ken Paxton. The Attorney General is the legal counsel to the governor, the legislature, and other agencies, boards, and commissions in state government. The office has 3,700 employees. It represents the state in litigation, enforces state and federal child support laws, provides legal counsel to state officials, and enforces state laws. It represents the state in criminal appeals in federal court, often death penalty cases. Most of the office's resources are devoted to collection of child support payments, collection of delinquent taxes, administration of the Crime Victims Compensation Program, and investigation of Medicare fraud. The office also issues AG or Attorney General opinions on legal questions. Another office in the executive branch of the Texas government is the Commissioner of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture in Texas has 6 major functions: marketing of Texas agricultural products, the development and promotion of agricultural products, pesticide regulation, pest management, product certification and safety inspection, and the inspection and certification of measuring devices, including gasoline pumps, electronic scanners, and scales. The State Board of Education is another part of the executive branch of the government in Texas. It consists of 15 members, elected from 15 districts in the state. The board members nominate one person among them to the governor to be the Commissioner of Education. Recently, the legislature has reduced the board's power. For example, it no longer selects the state's textbooks after years of battles over curriculum and textbook selection. The Secretary of State is appointed by the governor with the approval of the Senate. The Secretary of State has 3 main duties. One is to oversee elections, including voter registration, to prepare election information, and to supervise elections. The Secretary of State is also responsible for record keeping and management. He or she is the official keeper of state records, including records on business corporations and other commercial activities. Publishes the Texas Register, the source of official notices or rules, meetings, executive orders, and the opinions of the Attorney General. Last, international protocol is another duty of the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is supposed to provide services to state officials who interact with representatives of foreign countries. Last, I want to discuss briefly professional licensing and examining boards. There are about 40 professional licensing and examining boards in Texas. Some of the professions that are governed by these boards include accountants, architects, barbers, chiropractors, cosmetologists, dentists, exterminators, funeral directors, land surveyors, medical doctors, nurses, pharmacists, physical therapists, podiatrists, and veterinarians. Usually, a professional group asks for regulation by the state. They do so because they claim that their primary interest in doing so is to protect the public from incompetent or dishonest practitioners. But doing so also lets interested parties develop rules that favor the group and that limit entry into the profession at a cost to consumers. Some have said that there is a danger that boards and commissions dominated by members of their own profession will be more interested in making rules and regulations favorable to the profession than to anyone else, including the general public. In recent years, the appointment of some members of the board from outside the profession has become the norm. For example, there are non-physicians appointed to the State Board of Medical Examiners.